Good evening. I'm Elaine Quijano. 3 days after the crash of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, outrage is growing around the world over how the rebels in eastern Ukraine are handling both the victims' bodies and the physical evidence. More on that in a moment. But first, this has been the deadliest day yet in the Gaza conflict. 90 Palestinians were killed today, as were 13 Israeli soldiers, 2 of them American citizens. That pushes the 13-day death toll to at least 425 Palestinians and 20 Israelis. The White House says President Obama expressed, quote, serious concern over the escalating death toll in a phone call today to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Secretary of State Kerry will soon be heading to the region in search of a ceasefire. And the UN Security Council is meeting on Gaza tonight. We have 2 reports this evening, beginning with Barry Peterson in Gaza.
This was a day of running for your life in Gaza's eastern neighborhood of Shajaiwa. I was crying and shouting, Medea Abdul Atta told us. I saw bodies spread on the streets. I have never seen such a terrible thing. For hours, the shells poured in. Only briefly interrupted by humanitarian ceasefire. Rescuers raced to find the wounded, but mostly this was a day when they found those who died in the streets. I saw the Israeli tanks firing rounds at us, said Abu Hamza. Many houses were demolished. And most of all, this was a day of grieving at the overwhelmed morgue in the city's main hospital. There is a grim efficiency about death in this place. So many that as soon as a family identifies one body, there's another to take its place. Every face was a story of loss. This man's 22-year-old son was among the dead. And then there is the story of Faoud Jabbar, a paramedic, killed when his ambulance was hit by a shell. A relative tried to understand why, but she couldn't. He wasn't a fighter, she said. He was a fighter for humanity, an ambulance worker. Why did he deserve to die? This was, most of all, a day without answers. The blame game works like this. Israel says it only fires into areas where rockets have been fired into Israel. But residents told us there is no military activity in this neighborhood. Meanwhile, the death toll just keeps climbing. Elaine?
Barry Peterson in Gaza. Thank you. We turn next to our other big story developing tonight in eastern Ukraine. Pro-Russian separatists are moving the bodies of airliner crash victims to refrigerated train cars miles away. And there is international outrage over the handling of the bodies, as well as suspected tampering with the evidence. We begin with Mark Phillips at the crash site.
3 days after the crash and after 3 days of outcry from the families of the victims that they were still lying exposed and decomposing among the wreckage, the local authorities finally began to move them away. Under the supervision of the rebel militias that control the site, workers began loading the dead onto trucks and took them to a train waiting with refrigerated cars at a station about 10 miles away. Observers from the OSCE, the European Security Organization, were brought to the train to view the bodies, but delegation spokesman Michael Borkirkov said they couldn't count or examine them.
We opened the door. We had the doors open for us. The stench was overwhelming, as you might imagine, but the refrigeration is there.
At least 100 victims, though, remain unaccounted for, and more bodies were being removed today, to also be loaded on the train, where the rebels say they will stay until they can be identified by experts. And here they wait, stacked in refrigerated rail cars, stuck in a town without a morgue large enough to handle them, the innocent, unlucky victims of somebody else's war. The wreckage, too, remains unexamined. No crash investigation has begun and won't until the safety of aviation experts can be guaranteed. The plane's data recorders, though, have been found. The rebels now say they have them and will hand them over to international aviation authorities. But possession of the evidence is power here. and this crime scene is still controlled by the prime suspects. The victims of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 were killed because of a foreign civil war, and now their bodies, Elaine, are effectively being held hostage by it.
Mark Phillips in Ukraine, thank you. With Russia the target of so many allegations, we turn next to Clarissa Ward in Moscow. Clarissa, has there been any response from the Russian government to the mounting evidence of their involvement?
Good evening, Elaine. Well, tonight we're hearing that Russian President Putin, in an earlier conversation with the British Prime Minister David Cameron, cautioned against, quote, politicizing this tragedy until an investigation has been carried out. He also blamed the incident on the current unrest in Ukraine. This really echoing the limited statements that we've already heard from President Putin. And what's interesting to note, Elaine, is that on Russian TV stations today and this evening, we have not seen anything about Secretary Kerry's earlier remarks blaming Russia essentially for this tragedy. There's a growing counter-narrative emerging here in Russia that Russia is actually facilitating the investigation, as well as the separatists in Ukraine that it sponsors, and that it is the Ukrainian government which is responsible for blocking this investigation.
Clarissa Ward in Moscow, thank you. The U.S. laid out more evidence today that appears to link Russia to the missile attack on Flight 17. David Martin at the Pentagon has more.
A video taken on Friday shows what the U.S. says could well be the SA-11 missile launcher that shot down the airliner, being trucked across the border from Ukraine into Russia. One link in a chain of evidence, Secretary of State Kerry said, adds up to an overwhelming circumstantial case implicating Russia.
There's enormous amount of evidence, even more evidence than I just documented, that points to the involvement of Russia in providing these systems.
An intelligence assessment posted on the website of the American Embassy in Ukraine said a convoy of 150 military vehicles crossed from Russia into Ukraine last weekend. On Monday, Ukrainian intelligence recorded pro-Russian rebels making repeated references to having and repositioning the SA-11 system. On Thursday, at the same time the airliner went down, U.S. intelligence detected the launch of an SA-11 missile from rebel-controlled territory.
As we mentioned, 13 Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza today. And this evening, Hamas is claiming it took another Israeli soldier prisoner. With more on that, here's Holly Williams in Tel Aviv.
Elaine, the Palestinian militants say the name of the Israeli soldier that they claim to have taken hostage is Shaul Aron, although all the Israelis will say at this point is that they are looking into it. Now, those 13 soldiers who lost their lives were killed in 4 separate incidents, and the Israeli military told us tonight that they're running into a lot of resistance from the militants, who are armed with anti-tank rockets, rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons. There are reports that 2 of the dead soldiers were dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. One of them has been confirmed as Max Steinberg of Los Angeles.
Holly, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke to his country tonight. Did he say anything about how long the ground offensive will last?
Well, Israel has never put a time frame on it, and all that Mr. Netanyahu said tonight is that Israel will continue to act as necessary. But after international criticism over the bloodshed in Gaza, the Israeli Prime Minister repeated his accusation today that all civilian deaths are the fault of the militants, not of Israel, because he says that the militants are using civilians as human shields. Also today here in Israel, they buried 5 soldiers who were killed on Friday and Saturday. 3 of them were just 20 years old.
Holly Williams in Tel Aviv, thanks. Over 80% of the state of California is in a drought labeled as extreme by the U.S. Drought Monitor map. Residents have been asked to cut back on their water usage. But as Danielle Nottingham reports, not everyone is getting the message.
In the midst of California's unprecedented drought,
it's getting worse and worse, and I think everybody should be doing something about it.
Michael and Laura Cordy felt they were answering Governor Jerry Brown's urgent call to turn off the tap.
Everyone should try to do at least 20% conservation of their water use. This takes a coming together of all the people of California.
So now the grounds outside the state capitol building are turning brown, and so is the Cordy's lawn. On Tuesday, the same day, California officials authorized fines of up to $500 for overwatering. The Cortys got this letter from the city of Glendora.
It said you have 60 days to get your lawn looking like this, or else.
And the penalty was fines of $100 to $500 or criminal prosecution, whatever that means.
Yes, a $500 fine for underwatering.
It's kind of crazy considering the state of the state.
Yeah, it goes against common sense.
That's the dilemma facing Californians. Water so readily available, and yet so scarce.
There was some initial reporting that the suspect, while at the scene, shot the victim in the car. We are not sure that that is exactly what happened, as the investigation has unfolded overnight and the matter has been a little clearer. We're going to try and make a determination whether that's accurate or not. We're still working on that particular issue. We have a lot of work to do. What I can tell you definitively is, on the videotape, he pointed his weapon at the officers, and that is what perpetrated the shooting. But beyond that, no, we're not saying anything or making any suppositions.
Take me back to Thursday when this crash occurred. What was the narrative coming out of Russia today that you were so bothered by that you decided to resign the next day?
Well, the resignation had been a very, very long time coming, and I want to make that really clear. And it was something that I'd been in discussion with RT about for about the last year, about my unhappiness at the channel. And actually, in the last month or so, we've been discussing different options that were on the table. And so, you know, it was a very, very big decision that I'd already been weighing up whether my time at RT was coming to an end.
Let me show viewers a few examples of what's been heard on RT. Let's play that clip.
We are all potential terrorists, according to the American government. Have you heard the news in the U.S. lately? It's all bad for us Americans. So it might just be time for us to consider getting the hell out of this country.
Well, the U.S. government is annoyed with RT and Russian media and other international media, too, especially if they're speaking English language. In other words, a news source that the American people can hear something other than the truly propagandistic message that's relayed by CNN, MSNBC, ABC, all of the U.S. networks that echo the same line over and over again.
At one point, you saw a banner on the bottom of the screen that said media war, which is an interesting sort of phrase. There are differences between news shows on RT and opinion shows on RT. What I hear you saying is you would go home at night sometimes proud of the news stories you did, but embarrassed by what else you were seeing on the channel. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, when you run the clips there, it's really sad with RT, working for RT for so long, that I wish sometimes that people would highlight, you know, some of the great reporting that goes on there. And I cannot stress that enough, that there is so much of that team that
but by the way, Sarah, I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that. You know, RT was early on the Occupy Wall Street movement, taking it seriously before the American media did. It's a old example at this point, and honestly, I don't have many other newer examples to call on. But that's an example of them taking reporting seriously. But then you look at these opinion shows, and these opinion shows are, to me, they're just straight propaganda.
It is difficult, and I think you know that they haven't got that balance right with finding the line, as I said, between sort of being brash and just sort of pushing outright misinformation. Look, the thing is, though, with a lot of those opinion shows, that they also happen on other channels, and I feel a lot of the time, and actually I have it just with my reporting, certainly here in London over the past couple of years, a lot of jokes from colleagues saying, what story are you doing to make Britain look bad today? Well, look, if we're reporting a story where the British government should be held to account, or we're reporting a story that makes the US look bad because they've done something wrong, that's not propaganda in itself. I think it becomes propaganda when that's all that you're pushing and you're not willing to turn that spotlight onto your own government and onto the things that are wrong a little bit closer to home.
Let me ask you about a couple of your experiences as a reporter. I've read that at one point you were in Syria covering the civil war there for RT, and then the channel pulled you out. What happened?
It was one of the last times that I was on the ground in that country. That was a very good example for me, and I came very close then. I had a lot of very hard questions to ask myself, and it was a difficult time. I was obviously on the ground, and we'd been following the UN, and I'd seen firsthand what was happening to a lot of the people at the hands of the Syrian government. And my pieces were running alongside, opinion pieces and talking heads and the headlines that ran under my pieces. So there was lots of discussion about that where, I said, you can't undermine the work in that way. As I said, a lot of it very subtle, some of it not so subtle. And so there was a lot of talking at the time that they would, obviously, my editor's not happy, particularly with the way I was putting that story forward. Again, though, and this is credit to RT, the piece that I fought for ended up running, and there was one piece in particular where I'd gone down to Idlib that I felt very strongly that we should air. But after that aired, with many days still on my visa, I was told that the trip was up and I'd be returning to base.
RT said in a statement, "We show all sides of the story, even if everyone else has already decided which side is to blame." They were referring to the crash in Ukraine in that part of the statement. And they really dismissed you in the statement, saying, "You've declared that you choose the truth. Apparently we have different definitions of truth." How did you feel when you saw that?
The statement was not surprising, and it kind of sums up the problem that I had all the way through RT. I don't think there are different definitions and versions of the truth. I think there is the truth. I really believe that from the bottom of my heart, and that's why I work as a journalist, to get on the ground as often as I can and as much as I can and get the facts and establish the truth of the situation. And I think at RT, you can end up sort of swallowing yourself in these conspiracy theories. And okay, so there's been major criticism towards the channel. The first reaction should not be to point the finger back at everyone else. Take responsibility for what's going wrong. And I said that to my management. I've had a very good relationship with them over the years. We've had our ups and downs for sure, and many, many battles along the way. And over the last couple of years, it became a constant uphill battle to do my job properly. And when I spoke to my manager to resign, I said, look, please look at this and ask yourself how many more people will go before you start looking at the fact that there is obviously something very, very wrong with the system. Because for all the people you've seen do this and speak about it publicly like I am, behind the scenes there have been many, many more very talented colleagues who have left out of frustration or simply because they couldn't feel that they could contribute any more to working for a channel like that. So it's not something new. RT know that there is a big problem there. Unfortunately, up until this point, that they don't seem willing to change.
It does not sound like you'll be the last to leave, whether publicly or more privately. Sarah, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has met his Venezuelan counterpart Nicolas Maduro. The two sides have agreed to upgrade the two countries' ties from a strategic partnership for common development to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Venezuela is the third leg of Xi Jinping's four-nation Latin American tour. Earlier, he was welcomed by Maduro at Caracas airport. The two counterparts will also attend the closing ceremony of the 13th meeting of the China-Venezuela High-Level Joint Commission. The two sides are expected to sign a series of cooperation deals on finance, infrastructure, agriculture and high-tech industries. Before Venezuela, Xi Jinping visited Brazil and Argentina. In Brazil, he attended a 6th BRICS summit and met leaders of Latin American and Caribbean nations. He will also go to Cuba next.
I can tell you that as of today, we have found some technical details of this plane, which we suppose can be those black boxes.
Morday said that the black boxes had been delivered to the Donetsk People's Republic, a self-proclaimed territory in eastern Ukraine, and were under its government's control. He said that he was ready to pass the objects on to the International Civil Aviation Organization for further analysis. Also on Sunday, Reuters news agency released videos showing rescue workers covering and recovering what appeared to be a flight recorder from the wreckage of the Malaysia airliner. One man in a Ukrainian emergency ministry uniform is seen walking across the field in the eastern Donetsk region carrying an orange-colored box indicative of a flight data recorder and handing it to his colleague.
It's the deadliest day yet in the fighting between Israeli forces and the Islamic militant group Hamas. Palestinian health officials say dozens have died as Israeli troops backed by tanks and warplanes battle Hamas in Gaza City's crowded urban neighborhoods. Residents are fleeing. Israel says at least 13 of its soldiers were killed Sunday. The Israeli ground assault followed more than a week of heavy Israeli airstrikes. Israel says it sent thousands of troops into Gaza to destroy the launchers Hamas has been using to launch hundreds of rockets into Israel and the tunnels it's using for cross-border attacks. An Israeli cabinet minister says Hamas is to blame for scores of Palestinian casualties.
They are deliberately sending their women and children to stand next to missile launchers in order for them to get killed, and then they can cry to the world that they're being killed. This is cynical and cowardly.
Our issue is with the occupation, Israel, not Hamas and groups like Hamas.
The current fighting has killed more than 400 Palestinians and wounded about 3,000. Gaza's largest hospital only has an 11-bed emergency room and 6 operating theaters. Doctors there have been finding ways to improvise, such as using their cell phones for light when the power gets knocked out. Medical workers say some of the most difficult decisions involve who to treat first. Often it's the patient with the best chance to survive.
U 1969. godini. Merkalj rođen 1969. Sijetić Husein.
Ovdje sam danas na ispraćaju.
I came here today to say goodbye to my 6 brothers and my father, with my uncle, his 2 sons, and also with 30 to 40 members of the family.
To je što se tiče uže rodbine i što se tiče šire rodbine, najmanje još 30-40 članova.
We came with the family, with my mother and my sister, to bury my father. He was killed 22 years ago, and we are watching a surrealistic scene because 22 years after his death, we're burying him.
This mass grave has been discovered thanks to a former Serbian soldier who wanted to share with us this dark secret he was keeping to himself for 21 years, with which he wasn't going to sleep and with which he was waking up. He couldn't live with this burden anymore.
The iconic film Jaws had beachgoers fleeing in droves away from the shark. But in the real-life beach town of Chatham, Massachusetts, tourists are snatching up anything shark-related and can't seem to get enough of the underwater predator.
I just don't remember growing up and hearing about sharks at all. And so now, we come, my son is obsessed with sharks. He loves it. His bedroom is shark gray, and so he loves it. He wants to see more of them.
Local businesses are enjoying the frenzy as visitors hope to catch a sight of the great white.
I mean, truthfully, we've probably grown about 500% in terms of the sales of our shark apparel. We do sell just many days, thousands of dollars worth of it out of our store here.
We personally have a large clientele who continue to come back for our Shark Bite shirt. We do it different colors and different waves, long sleeve, short sleeve sweatshirt every year. Everyone kind of wants to get their new one every year.
Experts say the increase in shark sightings coincides with more prey in the area.
We've got this growing gray seal population over the last 4 decades that is drawing the sharks close to shore.
The local Chamber of Commerce, however, is cautiously embracing the added tourist attraction.
So far, we have seen great curiosity in a lot of things, including people watching, whale watching, and seal watching. So this just becomes the extra chapter in a book of people that are very curious about what goes on and who lives in the waters of Cape Cod.
The once feared marine menace creating some lasting summer memories for this Cape Cod town.